Talk to me, Joyce.
Talk to you. Well, I love the book. I love the book. I related to a lot in that book. And anybody who hasn't read it, please read it, especially all you women. I mean, men can read it too. But, you know, the mother-daughter relationship is something that if you had a great one your whole life, you were blessed. But I think a lot of women have that up and down relationship with their mom. We always seem to be okay with their dads. I don't know why. But I like the way you did that braided narrative. Could you kind of explain why you chose that? I mean, I think it worked very well.
Yeah, well, I started out, whenever you write a book, you just have to find the voice. And I started out first saying, okay, wow, this is a great love affair in, World War II, bombs are dropping, they're active, spying, daddy's falling into France in the parachute, blah, blah, blah. So I'll write a novel, and I'll turn them into fictional characters. I found it impossible to turn my parents into fictional. So then I said, okay, well then I'll just tell the story of their wonderful love affair. But it was absolutely clear that I wasn't there. I wasn't born. And that felt at too great a remove. And so then, as I was dealing with this and dealing with my mother, I would go down in the basement and I found all of these materials from Gibraltar, where her mother had died and all this stuff had been sent over and Mama just never could bear to look at it. I found all the letters her brother wrote during the war. I found amazing things. I would bring something up as she was leaving me with dementia, and I would read it to her, and she would come back. She'd say, oh yes, I wore a black dress the night after my honeymoon. Or she just had all these details at her fingertips. So the braided narrative, everything that when I'm dealing with her in dementia is in the present tense. Everything when I am telling her story is in the past tense. And I tried, and I hope I did it, that when I'm talking about them, they are Stuart and Tish, because I'm telling their story. But when I'm in part two, they are Mommy and Daddy, because it's my story then. And I go back and forth, as I said in the first part, and the editor said to me, you don't go back and forth in the second part. You don't go to your mother's present day dementia, whatever. And I said, no. I said her alcoholism was front and center my whole childhood, and it's my turn. Part two, I want me to be front and center, and I don't want empathy for my mother. I mean, it's funny, when you suffer as a child of an alcoholic, you carry those wounds for a long time. So that's how the whole thing worked out, and it was like a puzzle, really.
So when you talk about your mother's addiction there, how did you and your brothers cope with that? Did you join forces, or?
Yeah, we had a thing where Ian would come home. So I am the third child. Ian is only 13 months older than I am, which is why I have that silly nickname. I have a nickname which is Fuff, and the reason is because when Ian was presented with his new baby sister, he couldn't say Elizabeth, so he said Fuff. And Daddy called me Fuffleberry Much for a while, whatever. He would wait for me, because his school was much closer to home than mine, so he would wait at the back door of the kitchen. And when I got there, he would go like this, or like this. So this meant, okay, she's all right. This meant, head for the basement. Meant she was locked in her bedroom. You didn't know when she would come out. You didn't know what mood she'd be in. So I always say I could not have survived this childhood without the boys. And Joe was the ringleader, and he was an electronics expert. So he had a whole office set up in the basement. And under his tutelage, we dug a 14-foot hole in the front yard as a bomb shelter. He didn't think that my parents were being serious enough about the bomb. We ran a private telephone line through the storm sewers of Washington. His best friend was the son of a man named Richard Bissell, who was responsible for the Bay of Pigs and was deputy planner for the CIA. And he actually dropped a microphone down Mr. Bissell's chimney. You know, I mean, we were ridiculous. And we did run this whole private line into the Bissell's house. And then we had other people in the neighborhood. And at one point in the sewer, I was the one in the sewer with Joe, because I could stand up straight and pay out the wire. I said, you know, Joe, with the rats and the slugs and stuff, I said, why are we doing this? And he said, we have to have a private telephone line. We don't want them to hear what we are saying. And I thought, well, what we're saying is, are you going to Murphy's at 5 or at 6? Really? But it kept us busy. And in fact, Daddy bet Joe that he couldn't bug a dinner party. He started Joe down the life of crime, that he couldn't bug a dinner party without Daddy knowing it. So we ran a telephone under the rug, and we ran a microphone right up under the chair, under Daddy's chair, and during the whole dinner party. And the next day, Joe comes in with a huge Wallensack reel-to-reel tape recorder and hits play. And there's the dinner party. Daddy stands up, he pulls out the money clip, he peels off 5 tens, he hands it to him, you know. It was like that. And in the end, Joe ended up bugging the headmaster's study at his boarding school, and he got caught and got kicked out. MIT wanted him right then.
And CIA and everybody else. And how old was he then?
14.
14, you can imagine? Oh my goodness.
It was quite the character.
I also, when I was reading it, I kept thinking about how I got the impression that as children, you didn't really understand what was happening with your mother.
You're absolutely right.
So,
we did not.
so how
do we perceive it?
Yes, how did you?
Ian and I tossed around a lot of big fat words like schizophrenic, mentally ill. We didn't know what we were talking about. But we knew that she switched. It was like, my mother was what they call a chemical alcoholic. So she just needed the bottle to go under her nose practically. She needed a sip, and she would be this other person. So she was like a double personality. And the thing we knew was when she smoked, she was doing whatever she was unreliable. Don't get near her when she was smoking. She only smoked when she drank. And the other thing, and the boys and I can all do it, is that she did this with her hair. Constantly like this. And that was another sign. When my father came home from work, I was often at the living room, and he would walk in and look at me and say, where is she? And if I said the bedroom, his whole body would sink. He'd go up the stairs, there'd be a muffled conversation, he'd come down the stairs, and he'd go to the phone. Hello, this is Stuart Alsop. Yes, I'm coming, I'm supposed to come for dinner at the British Embassy tonight. Yes, no, I'll be coming. No, my wife isn't well, so I'll be alone. So he left us with her. And she was locked in the bedroom. There was one time when a man came in down below and stole things while we were in the house. And the hard thing for me was that we were all sent to boarding school, but the boys went to boarding school quite quickly, and I had 3 years at home as the oldest child. So I would sit there and think, okay, if there's a fire, do I go get Stuart first, who's up the stairs, or do I try and grab Nikki and then, I was like this little fire drill sergeant, or just feeling responsible, which happens
in the house.
Yeah, I was the mother. Yeah.
Did your father ever try to explain to your children what was going on?
Finally, I was freshman at Sarah Lawrence. My brother Ian was a sophomore at Dartmouth, and he came down to New York to a party. And we were buying, this is so stupid that I remember this, we were buying ice in a deli. And he turns to me, I'm standing behind him, and he says, I know what's wrong with Mommy. And I said, what's wrong with her? He said, she's an alcoholic. I said, what? She just drank Coke all that time. We never knew what was in the Coke. And I said, how did you find out? And he said, I finally confronted Daddy. And Daddy said, well, what's wrong with you? Don't you know what's wrong with her? Don't you? Yeah, so that's how we found out. Yeah.
That was something. So do you think it was related, that turning to alcohol was related to marrying an older man, marrying a man who wasn't home all the time, or how
All
did
of
she,
those.
all of the above?
Yeah, she was very
Having too many children?
having too
That
many
would be a good
children.
reason.
She was very shy,
Mhm.
very shy, and very efficient. And Daddy used to say, you know, she doesn't chatter like those Long Island debutantes. He said, she will take very good care. She will manage me. And Daddy needed management. You know, he lost things. I never forget when he wrote Stay of Execution, Dick Cavett did an interview with him for 2 hours. Those were the old days. He had different colored socks on, and he had a hole in his sweater. I mean, you know, I thought Mommy didn't manage it very well that time. So he was very taken with her, but they really didn't know each other. I mean, here he graduated from Yale, he was going to be this big journalist, and she was an extremely shy, very bright, but uneducated and unsophisticated 18-year-old who arrives in America and has a baby 4 months later, or 7 months, 6 months later. So she just turned to the drink because, you know, every other night they were out with very famous people. She had to sit next to senators and congressmen and Supreme Court justices. And in those days in Washington, everybody came to everything. They didn't fight and stay apart. And so Uncle Joe and Daddy might excoriate someone in the morning column, and they'd be there for dinner, you know, shouting and yelling and arguing. And Mummy was in the middle of all of that fray. She also had to entertain a great deal. So I think she just said, okay, a little alcohol will just help.
Take the edge
off, and it got worse and worse. But she did pass out once at the British Embassy, and Daddy had to take her home, and he said, no more. No more, and of course that's when us went under bed.
So when I was reading it and your relationship with your mom, and I don't want to give the story away because so I don't want to get into too many details, but there were some really, really open and personal times with your
Conversation.
Conversations with you and your mom,
Yeah.
and it probably opened up maybe wounds, but maybe healed some. Is that?
Hey, that's a good point. My mother went to Al-Anon, AA. I went to Al-Anon. She went to AA. She did the 12 steps, but there is a famous step where you apologize to people. I think it's called the 5th step. And she never was able to do that directly. However, that conversation, which I described at the very end, when she has dementia and she suddenly came back to me, and she said, what was it like when I was drinking? And I thought I could duck away from this. I don't know how long she's going to be in this world, but I had to tell the truth. And so I said, well, you never knew. I never knew, Mommy. It was like walking through a minefield. Where would I put my foot? Because you could blow up at the slightest thing. And she started to cry. And I handed her the Kleenex box, but she didn't give up asking. And that must have been so hard for you and your brothers and your father. And, you know, so that was her 5th step. That was the closest that we would ever get to an apology. And it was sufficient for me.
Sure.
Yeah.
But she did have the time or the opening there that she could reach out
And also
it had to be like refreshing for her, not but rewarding to hear her say that she was aware of that.
Yes, she was aware of it.
But not in her control.
And it was surprising to me that she really came back like that because she was in dementia. She got sober at the age of 51. My father died when she was 48. So she had him from 18 to 48, 30 years.
Wow.
Then she got sober at 51, and she got dementia at 82. So I had 31 years of a mother. She wasn't a mother to a little child, but she was a mother. We were on equal. It was almost like we were friends. Mm-hmm. And she was very supportive. I had a very difficult divorce. She was there. She came to the courtroom. She offered money. She always was at the end of the telephone. So I really felt wonderful about that, that we had that. People asked me if I could have published this book when my mother was alive. And I said no. I wrote a book called Knock Knock Who's There, about two boys. It's a teenage novel, and it's about two boys whose father dies of a blood disease, and after he dies, they discover their mother's an alcoholic. So I was skating very close to the reality. And I sent her a copy when it was published. And I said, I wrote this out of anger, but I ended it with love. And she went to her AA meeting, and she described the horror of this. I always loved this story, and the AA people said, well, this is, she said, what are you going to do about it? And she said, oh, I'm going to write my daughter a letter. And they said, well, where does she live? Tokyo? Asia? What do you mean you're going to write her a letter? Where does she live? She lives in New York. Well, why don't you go see her? So she called me up, and this shows you what the family dynamic was. She said, dear, I read the book, and I'm coming to see you. And I said, why don't you write me a letter? I didn't want to, and it was very tough, and I describe it in the book. It was a tough 8-hour, sort of this happened to me at this point, this is why I did, back and forth. Very honest conversation.
I know that you were, you had asked, I can't remember the gentleman's name now, the writer, and he gave you some.
Oh, William Zinsser.
Okay, and he said, you can't write about both of them.
Yeah. And I tried so hard to.
Well, you did.
I did.
You did in a way.
Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, he said you can't write about both your parents at the same time, which I found fascinating. And I realized my father had written a memoir. There are 2 books written about him, and there was a play on Broadway about him and Uncle Joe. So I really didn't write about Daddy. It was Mummy's story that I wanted to excavate. So
now, in one part of it, suddenly she became a person to me, I guess, because she was having this problem, and everybody knows that alcohol is a disease, and but then she got sober, and she worked for the Red Cross.
yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that without giving the whole story away?
Yeah, no, it's
But
fine.
it was a beautiful side of her.
Yeah, I often thought Mummy should never have had children. I mean, Catholicism for her was kind of a curse because she loved working. She was a decoding agent with MI5 at the age of 17. And then she had a lot of volunteer jobs. And then after Daddy died and she got sober, she got a job as a technologist with the Red Cross, a blood technologist. And I said, Mommy, how do you know how to do this? She said, it's a lot like cooking. You have a test tube and you put this and you put it. And she also was the first person to bring hospice to Washington, because hospice was a British-driven program and it really wasn't known here. But because she was British and had so many friends there. So those 15 years of her life were glorious. 51, she worked for 15 years and she loved it and was very, very happy in those years.
I read that little.
What she says at the end.
Oh, yeah.
There's a
You
postcard
have to read
from
this
the
book.
grave. Yeah. At the end, I found something after she died that I never knew she had written, and I put it in the book. I'm thinking we should take questions.
Yes, I
What do
think
you
it's time.
Do we
Yes.
have any?
Do we have any questions?